Good afternoon. My name is Debbie Hersman. I'm the chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board. I'm here to provide you with an update on our team's investigative work into the Asiana 214 crash that occurred here on Saturday night. I'd like to take an opportunity to introduce you to our investigator in charge, Mr. Bill English. He's leading our team of investigators. We have about 20 investigators who are out working, and he's coordinating that work and leading the investigation for our agency. I'm going to give you an update on what our team has been doing over the last 24 hours since I last spoke to you. Our operations group did conclude the 4 pilot interviews yesterday afternoon. I already briefed you on the 3 flying pilots and what they shared with our investigators. We do, in our investigations, look at pilots' 72-hour history, their work-rest history, to try to understand if they were fatigued, what conditions that they were working under, if there are any issues that could have affected their performance in flight. And so let me just give you a brief summary. We've got the 2 crew members who we talked about yesterday, and I'll just quickly go back over the crew that we talked about yesterday. The pilot in the left seat, we call him the flying pilot. He was undergoing his initial operating experience in the 777. He was an experienced pilot, had been flying other aircraft, had about 10,000 hours. He was halfway through his initial operating experience on this flight. The pilot in the right seat, we're calling him the instructor pilot. He's also a training captain. This was his first trip as a training captain in the 777. He also has a significant amount of experience, as well as 3,000 hours in the 777. The pilot that was in the jump seat, we're calling him the relief first officer. And the pilot that's seated in the cabin, we're calling him the relief captain. So just when we're talking about the crew, that's the terminology that we'll use for the purpose of this press briefing. We were interested in the work-rest history for the 2 pilots who were seated in the left and the right seat at the time of the accident. I'm going to share their 72-hour, or the history that we gained from talking with them yesterday. The flying pilot stated that on July 5th, he was off duty at home. He had about 8 hours of sleep the night before, and then he went to the airport early to prepare for the flight. He wanted to make sure that he was prepared as he was going to be working with this instructor pilot for the first time as they were paired together for his initial operating experience. He briefed with the instructor pilot at 1440, and this is in Seoul. He was in the cockpit a half an hour before he took command. The instructor pilot related he had about 8 hours of rest the night before. He spent the day relaxing with his family. He reported for duty at the airport around 2:20 p.m. And he worked, and again, this crew is paired together. They worked about 4 hours and 15 minutes on the first leg of the flight, on the takeoff. And then they were off duty. The relief crew came in for about 5 hours. And then they returned to the cockpit for the last hour and a half of the flight. The first officer, the relief first officer, joined them when they got to about 10,000 feet. Our systems group has been out working. There are a number of avionics systems that have been harvested. We're very interested in making sure that we take a look at all of the equipment on the aircraft, and this is one part of what we'll be doing. There was an ELT, or an emergency locator transmitter, that had been going off since the crash. They did locate the ELT and they turned that off. It transmits a position beacon and a distress signal, so if folks are trying to locate an aircraft in a search and rescue operation, it makes it easier to find it. Obviously, everyone knew that this aircraft was here. We just needed to get that ELT turned off because it was still transmitting. They're accessing some of the flight control actuators, and they retrieved the QAR, the quick access recorder, and have sent it back to our lab. The quick access recorder is often used to quickly download data from a flight. Operators use this data for evaluations of performance of the aircraft, of the crew, identifying any anomalies. I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about automation. There have been a lot of questions about autopilot, auto throttles, and some of the auto flight regimes in the aircraft. And so I'm going to start kind of a little bit basic, and we're going to work down to a few more specifics. When we talk about auto flight, we're talking about tools that are available to pilots in the cockpit of airplanes. They can be simple or they can be sophisticated. And so in a pilot like, in an airplane like the 777, we have very sophisticated automation. But the pilots can hand fly or fly manually the airplane from takeoff through cruise flight for 10 hours to landing. They can do that without using any automation if they'd like. They can also use an extensive amount of automation. In fact, airplanes today are sophisticated enough that you can achieve an auto landing in 0-0 conditions. So you can have limited visibility, you can not be able to approach the airport under visual conditions, and the airplane can land itself. So you can do everything manually, you can look for a lot of automation, or you can do a combination of something in between. Automation can be very helpful to pilots. It can decrease their workload, and this is particularly important when they're in high workload environments. Automation can also help with things like efficiency. It can help be able to space aircraft more closely together so you can get more airplanes into a certain airspace or more takeoffs and landings at an airport. Automation can help achieve better fuel efficiency. Automation can help ensure that pilots don't bust altitude. It can help maintain a level of safety and efficiency in the cockpit. So when you look at automation, and I think a lot of people are familiar with autopilot, and most people probably think of autopilot as providing assistance in two axes, heading and altitude. That's a basic autopilot. But today's equipment in aircraft now is so much more sophisticated. And so when I'm going to talk about this, I want you all to recognize that there's a level of sophistication here. We're not going to get into a lot of detail, but for the layperson, when you think about automation, it can do a lot. It can assist the pilots. But there are two pilots in the cockpit for a reason. They're there to fly, to navigate, to communicate, and if they're using automation, a big key is to monitor. And pilots are trained to monitor. They have training and monitoring skills. And in fact, when they break up their duties in the cockpit, you will have one pilot in a two-person crew who's designated as the pilot flying, and the other pilot is designated as the pilot monitoring. So when we talk about autopilot, when we talk about auto thrust, there are things that the pilots do to activate these different modes or actions, and there are things that they can do for the pilots. There are computers in the cockpit, there are computers in the airplane. These computers talk to each other, they're interconnected, and so the pilots may choose to activate certain heading or speed or modes, and they do that by turning knobs and pushing buttons to make this happen. They set them where they want them, and they activate the selection that they want, and then the airplane figures out how to achieve what the pilot has commanded. So let's say an air traffic controller directs a pilot to head in a certain direction, gives them heading 030. They can actually select a heading and the autopilot will take them in that heading. If the air traffic controller tells them that he wants them to maintain 180 knots, they can select that, and they select a mode to maintain 180 knots. When they do these things, sometimes they're doing something that's a single command, but sometimes it's going to need to draw from multiple systems. And so those systems can be coupled. Autopilot may very well be relying on auto throttles as well. Autopilot helps pilots with pitch, roll, attitude, and heading, and auto thrust helps them with power. So they're making inputs into the flight computers to get the results that they want. So let's talk about auto throttle. Auto throttle is about power. Auto throttle can provide to pilots speed. It can help them with descending, and it can help them with climbing. It's going to do different things. There are 5 discrete modes in auto throttle that you can see in flight. So when we talk about auto throttle, I'm going to give you a very simple example to help kind of explain how auto throttle works. And I would like to bring up another vehicle, a car. So if you use cruise control in a car, you can set the cruise control for 50 miles per hour. But if the cruise control allows the car's speed to increase to 55, 60, 70, 75, the driver needs to intervene by putting his foot on the brake or disconnecting the cruise control. When we talk about cruise control in a car, I want you to think about that like an old calculator that we used maybe 20 years ago. And then we're going to talk about auto throttle in a cockpit. And that's like an iPhone with GPS. It's much more sophisticated. It's not cruise control in a car. It's a different thing. But just understand that the pilot sets what he wants in different modes, but then there is a responsibility to monitor that he's getting what he asked for. So with this flight, in the last 2.5 minutes of the flight, from the data on our flight data recorder, we see multiple autopilot modes, and we see multiple auto throttle modes. We need to understand what those modes were, if they were commanded by the pilots, if they were activated inadvertently, and if the pilots understood what the mode was doing. And so I know there's a lot of questions about auto throttle. We still need to look at the data that's on the FDR. We need to validate that data, and we need to work with the manufacturer, Boeing, to understand what the design and expectations of those automated modes are. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the runways and air traffic control. We've got a slide here of the airport, and I just want to bring this up just to share a bit with you about why certain sequencing is done coming into the airport. Airport efficiency is predicated on the ability to pair arrival aircraft on both runway 28 left and 28 right. And so you've got 2 parallel runways on 28 left and 28 right. Because they are so close together, you have got to space the aircraft out that are coming in on those parallel runways so they're not right next to each other. They have to be alternating so that they're coming in offset. So they're zippering in as they're landing. And so when I talk about some of these ATC directions, understand that they're being given directions so that those runways can be slotted appropriately. I'm going to talk about some ATC plots right now, some radar plots. This first one is an overview of a radar plot, and this is of the Asiana 214 flight. You can see the red or the blue targets, and these targets are sampled approximately every 5 seconds. And this data was provided by the Federal Aviation Administration to our staff. Slide 2, at 11:21, Asiana 214 reports the San Francisco airport in sight to the approach controller and is cleared for the visual approach to runway 28 left. From the point of where this landing clearance is issued, all altitude adjustments are at the discretion of the crew of Asiana 214. So the next slide shows that the pilot is issued a speed restriction of 180 knots until the 5-mile final approach, and is then instructed to contact the control tower. So this is a handoff between Sacramento, the Sacramento area, Northern California TRACON, to San Francisco Airport's control tower. So remember I mentioned to you the issuance of the speed restrictions is related to that slotting of airplanes coming in on 28 left and 28 right. So that's why they're asking them to maintain speed so they can properly space those other airplanes that are coming in. Now, I'm just going to point something out to you. We're going to go to the next slide. Oh, you know what? We've moved too far ahead. Okay, on this slide, I just want to point out here, if you look at the bottom, you'll see that they're instructed to turn to 030 degrees and descend to 3,000 feet. This is the kind of thing that the pilots may use the automation in the cockpit to help them with. And so when they're instructed to turn to 030, they can enter that in, and the aircraft will calculate exactly what needs to happen in the turn to get them to that heading. Descending to 3,000 feet, the same way. And so just as they were asked to maintain 180 knots, again, that is something that the pilots can ask the computers to do for them. Or they can hand fly the plane, they can do it manually, they can achieve those marks on their own by hand flying the aircraft. So thanks, Kelly. For the next slide. And this is the you can see the two bridges here, and so I think for those of you who are local, you can see the Dumbarton and San Mateo bridges that they're going to cross over. At 11:26. Asiana 214 checked in on San Francisco tower frequency for final on runway 28 left. The local controller issued several instructions to other aircraft that were in various phases of departure from San Francisco or that had just arrived in San Francisco and did not immediately respond to Asiana 214. At 11:26:56, Asiana 214 again contacted the air traffic control tower and initiated communication with the local controller. The local controller then acknowledged Asiana, subsequent contact, and a landing clearance was issued. The landing clearance was issued, and I think, Kelly, is this the last one? We've got one more. The landing clearance was issued when the airplane was about 1.5 miles from the threshold. And I know that you all will have questions. It's not unusual for an air traffic controller to not immediately respond if they are busy and if they're in a heavy workload period. The second contact, the controller responded. And so we're providing you some information about the last radar plots that we have. I'm going to talk to you now about survival factors. When we look at the aircraft, there's a business class and what Asiana refers to as a travel class, or what we might call here in the U.S. an economy class on the aircraft. The business class has a seating configuration of 1 at the window, 2, and 1. The traveler class has a configuration of 3, 3, and 3 across. So I'm talking to you about the seat spacing in each of those cabins. I had a question yesterday about seat belts, and our investigators have advised that the seat belts in business class are lap shoulder belts, and the seat belts in the travel class are lap only. We've talked about the aircraft doors and slides. There are 8 exit doors on the aircraft, 4 on the left and 4 on the right. And we've marked them here. I'm going to refer to the doors by each of these numbers and letters. And so it's 1 left, 1 right, 2 left, 2 right, and so on. There were 12 flight attendants on board the aircraft. Our team interviewed 6 of them yesterday, and the other 6 remained hospitalized and they were not interviewed. Of the flight attendants that we interviewed, there were 2 flight attendants at the 1L door, one of whom was called the cabin manager, or we'd call them the purser, the lead flight attendant. Both of those crew members were interviewed by our team, and these crew members, I'm going to talk about in a little bit, were the ones that engaged with the flight crew about evacuation, the flight attendants at 1L. There were 2 flight attendants seated at 2L, one of whom is also qualified as a cabin manager, but was not acting in that capacity on this flight. But he seemed to be, in a sense, the lead flight attendant in the traveler class. There was 1 flight attendant at 3L, and that flight attendant was interviewed, and the 2 flight attendants at 2L were also interviewed. There was 1 flight attendant at 1R. That flight attendant is hospitalized, and she was pinned by one of the evacuation slides that deployed inside of the aircraft. There is 1 flight attendant at the 2R door. She was also pinned by one of the evacuation slides that deployed inside of the aircraft. She was hospitalized. She broke a bone in her lower leg. She's been released, and she was interviewed by our investigators. There was 1 flight attendant at 3R, and that flight attendant was hospitalized. And there are 4 flight attendants in the aft portion of the cabin near doors 4L and 4R. 3 of those flight attendants and their seats were ejected from the aircraft. 1 of the flight attendants in the rear, in the aft cabin, was found inside the aircraft with the seat. All 4 of those flight attendants are hospitalized, and they were not interviewed. All of the passenger seating remained on the aircraft. None of the passenger seats were ejected from the aircraft. So I mentioned that the escape doors inflated inside the aircraft at 1R and 2R, and they pinned the flight attendants. Those flight attendants needed assistance to get out from underneath those slides. They couldn't do it alone. The evacuation slide normally inflates when it's in the armed position and the door is opened. It is unknown at this time why the slides inflated inside the aircraft during the accident sequence. The manufacturer of those slides has offered assistance to our investigators, and we will be retaining the slides for evaluation and testing. The interviewees, and remember we interviewed 6 of the 12, they all shared a similar experience of an initial impact followed by a secondary impact. The flight attendants that were near the slides that inflated, that were seated in those areas, and remember there were other flight attendants seated in 1L, 1R, 2L, and 2R. They described the inflation of those slides as taking place after that second or final impact when they came to rest. They also all related that the damage in the cabin was more severe in the aft section of the cabin, as well as injuries. After the aircraft came to a stop, the cabin manager, who was seated in 1L, asked the flight attendant who was seated with her in that area to go to the flight deck and ask the flight crew what to do. The specific interest was, should we evacuate? Should we begin an evacuation? The flight crew told the flight attendant not to initiate an evacuation. They were communicating with the tower about the emergency. The lead, or the cabin manager, made an announcement over the PA for people to stay in their seats and to not evacuate. At around the same time, the flight attendant who was seated in 2L, and this was the senior flight attendant who was also trained as a cabin manager, he stated he looked to 2R and he could see fire outside of the window. He sent the flight attendant who was sitting with him at 2L up to the front of the cabin to let them know that there was fire and that they needed to evacuate. The aircraft evacuation began after that. When we talk about times here, I want to share with you that these are very preliminary times. There is an event sequence as the airplane is coming down. There's a lot of dust and a lot of debris, and so we'll get more specific times later. I'm giving you approximates now. The fire that the lead flight attendant in the travel section observed was outside of the aircraft, and he described it as near row 10 on the aircraft. And this is consistent with where that engine ended up that's tucked in next to the fuselage. We talked yesterday about the oil that had leaked out from a tank in the engine onto the hot engine, and that our power plants team identified fire in that section of the engine. They stated when the evacuation began that they noticed that the emergency lighting had come on in the aircraft. A minute and a half after the aircraft came to a stop, and this is based on video evidence, a minute and a half after the aircraft came to a stop, door 2L, closely followed by door 1L, were opened and the slides were deployed. The passengers began evacuating down the slides. And then we saw also passengers evacuating from 3R. About 2 minutes after the crash, the first emergency response vehicle arrived on scene. And approximately 3 minutes after the crash, the first extinguishing agent was started to apply to the aircraft on the right side. From their interviews, the flight attendants revealed to our investigators that they tried to expedite the passenger evacuation procedures by directing passengers to doors that weren't as crowded. And they were also fighting the fire. As the evacuation went on, there wasn't fire in the cabin while most of the passengers were in there. But as the evacuation went on, the fire did continue, and the flight attendants and the flight crew were involved in trying to fight the fire on the inside. We had flight attendants that were pinned, that they were trying to get out from these slides. They were using fire extinguishers to do that. We also know that ARF, or Airport Rescue and Firefighting responders, came in. They did bring a hand line in, or a hose, and try to fight the fire from the inside, and they also assisted with passenger evacuations. The flight attendants described a light haze or a dust in the cabin, and I know many of you all have seen some of the footage. There is a lot of debris and dust that you can see external to the aircraft, and so they described some of that in the aircraft. They didn't describe fire burning inside the aircraft, the seats, or any black smoke, but they did, as they were trying to get that flight attendant out that was pinned, describe fire coming through as in the area of the window or the fuselage. They stated that they did seatbelt compliance checks, and we are interested in interviewing the remaining cabin crew members as well as any survivors that wish to be interviewed to help us understand survival factors and performance of equipment inside the airplane, injuries, and where people were seated. Our power plants team, the engines team, is wrapping up their work. They're doing their field notes, and they will continue to do some examinations of the engines, but they will do those off-site. Our performance team is continuing their documentation. They expect to wrap that up as early as this evening to allow the salvage operations on the runway to begin. And what that means is there's a lot of debris. We talked about those rocks that had been carried from the seawall, the airplane debris on the runway. There's a lot to clean up. Once that's cleaned up, then it'll be up to the airport to make repairs to the runway and to the equipment that supports the runway and make determinations about when it will reopen. But Bill, do you expect your team will be releasing the runway tonight?
That's the plan.
Okay, great. Great. So there's still probably a lot of work ahead before the runway will be reopened, and there are a number of different groups involved in that, but the NTSB will likely be releasing the runway certainly within the next 24 hours, if not tonight. I'm ready to take your questions. Yes, sir.
The laptop pilot stated in his interview with the Korean authorities that there was a flash of light at 500 feet that blinded him. So what do you know about that?
Just to make sure that I have understood your question, that it was the flying pilot. The flying pilot has stated to Korean authorities that there was a flash of light temporarily at 500 feet that blinded him. Our investigators did interview the flying pilot. He did relay some of that information to our investigators. We need to understand exactly what that is, identify if there are any sources of light. We did have an interview with him that was a good interview. He was very cooperative, and he did talk to us about the approach and landing. He relayed that to us, but it was a temporary issue. Yes, sir.
Stated that the pilot on the right had more hours. Did that make him the senior officer on board? And could he have done more to challenge the flying pilot? Or was there some sort of deference to that flying pilot?
The question is, the pilot in the right seat, the instructor pilot, may have had more hours than the flying pilot, and could he have done more to challenge him? And did he show deference to him on the approach and landing? Does that capture what you were looking for? Our team has interviewed all of the pilots. We have the cockpit voice recorder. They're working through the transcription of the cockpit voice recorder. That will certainly give us some information about the tone in the cockpit, the working relationship of the crew members, and how they communicated. We do know that the pilot that's in the right seat, the instructor pilot, is the pilot in command. Usually the pilot in command is sitting in the left seat. In this case, the instructor pilot is the pilot in command. He's in the right seat. The flying pilot's in the left seat. And so we are certainly interested to see if there are any issues where there are challenges to crew communication, if there's an authority gradient where people won't challenge one another. But we have talked about this, about crew resource management and how this has been taught for decades in the aviation industry to really address issues like that, to make sure that a junior pilot feels comfortable challenging a senior pilot, and to make sure that a senior pilot welcomes feedback in a cockpit environment from all members of the crew and considers it. And so we have a pilot in command who's the monitoring pilot. It is his responsibility to make sure that this is a safe flight as the pilot in command. We will be looking at those relationships as we move forward. Yes, sir.
David Knowles, New York Daily News. I'm wondering, at 500 feet, that was the first indication pilots had their trajectory was really off, and I'm wondering about how much time that was until the plane actually hit the ground. How much time are we talking about to try and correct that trajectory?
Can you restate the first part of your question?
My understanding that the pilots first became aware that their trajectory was off, or reported that at 500 feet, the elevation of 500 feet. I'm wondering how long we're talking in time from that point to when the crash occurred, and how much time they would have had to try and correct that.
The question is, the questioner has stated that at 500 feet may have been the first time that the pilots became aware that their trajectory was off, and how much time did they have to make corrections. I think that captures what you asked. I want to make sure that we're very clear here. There are different places in the approach. There are places where the pilots identified that they were high on the approach, and that was further out. I believe that was 4,000 feet. Bill, I don't know if you can confirm. Kelly will check the notes. We've briefed on this before. The instructor pilot talked about being high. There were statements that were made to our investigators during the interview that at 500 feet they recognized that they were low. And so I just want to make sure that we're not stating that the first time that they recognized that their trajectory was off is at 500. They had opportunities all through the glide path to recognize. We've given you select information about certain points along the way, but you really need to take it as a whole in context. So, but when you're talking about when they noticed that they were low at about 500 feet, at 500 feet, the airspeed was about 134 knots, and they had over 34 seconds prior to impact. Does that answer your question? Okay. Matt?
Thank you, Matt Wall, New York Times. You said that the auto throttle was armed but not actually engaged at the end of the approach. And you said, as I understand it, that they were scrolling through different autopilot modes. Did some of those modes enable the auto throttle and some did not, and the last one did not?
Matt's asking a complicated question, so let me kind of bring it back. You've got actually a few statements in there. The first statement was that the auto throttle was engaged but not active. I don't.
Was armed but not
Yeah.
engaged.
Okay. Was armed but not engaged. I don't think that we've made that statement, and so I just want to make sure that we're clarifying that. We've stated that it was armed, but when questioned, I stated that armed does not necessarily mean active. Okay, so let's just be clear. We haven't said exactly where the auto throttles were, what mode they were in at this point. As I mentioned, we have multiple autopilot modes and multiple auto thrust modes in the last 2.5 seconds. We're trying to make sure that we understand exactly what those are, that the data traces are valid, that they're correct, and that that data is true. You had other questions about at the end?
I'm sorry, did you mean to say that the multiple auto thrust modes in the last 2.5 seconds?
I'm sorry, 2.5 minutes.
Okay.
2.5 minutes.
In the,
Thank you, fatigue is starting to set in.
in the final mode that the autopilot was in, was that a mode that allowed the auto throttle to operate, or a mode that did not allow the auto throttle to operate?
Matt, the question is, in the final mode that the airplane was in, did that allow the auto throttle to operate or not operate? I think at this point we really want to make sure we validate the data, we understand what we're seeing, and we understand how all of these modes are interconnected. And I want to go back to that conversation that we had in the beginning about the automation and how the level of sophistication is very high, and it's interconnected. And so there are multiple modes being engaged. We need to understand how they work together and what it means. And so we still have some work to do in this area. If we can get back to you with more information, we'll do that. We've got an FDR group that is continuing to work in Washington, and we need to have a few further conversations before we come out with that final information. Yes.
Hi, it's Martha Mendoza with the Associated Press. Could the flash of light have been a laser, and did any of the pilots think they were responsible for this accident? And Brenda, can you share a little of the...
How about just one question? Which question do you want me to answer?
There was a flash of light. Could that have been a laser, and did the pilots take responsibility?
The question is, what could the flash of light have been? Could it have been a laser? We really don't know at this point what it could have been. That information was relayed to us by the pilot. We need to look into it. We need to understand what he's talking about. We appreciate that the crews have spoken to us and that they've provided us the opportunity to interview them. We may need to follow up with them to clarify some things, and we may need to look at other things that are going on. Yes, in the back?
Yeah, it seems a little odd that the crew, after a plane crash, would announce they don't evacuate. Is that normal? I mean, what happened there?
Sure, the question is, it seems a little unusual that the crew would not announce in order to evacuate after a plane crash. The pilots indicated that they were working with air traffic control. We don't know what the pilots were thinking, but I can tell you in previous accidents, there have been crews that don't evacuate. They wait for other vehicles to come to be able to get the passengers out safely. Certainly, if there's an awareness that there's fire on board an aircraft, that is a very serious issue. We did have flight attendants communicating with each other once they heard the announcement about not evacuating, that there was fire and the evacuation started. We certainly want to take a look at that. The pilots are in the front of the airplane. They really don't have a good sense of what's going on behind them. They need to get that information from the flight attendants. But we will certainly be looking into that issue. Hindsight is 20/20. We all have a perspective that's different than some of the people who are involved in this. We need to understand what they were thinking, what information that they had, what their procedures are, if they complied with those procedures, and if that evacuation took place in a timely manner. I talked to you yesterday about some of the standards, some of the requirements for evacuations, and We talked about that in order to get certified, an aircraft manufacturer has to show that a fully loaded aircraft can be fully evacuated within 90 seconds. What we saw here was that the first doors and slides weren't opened for about 90 seconds. Yes, sir.
KBS, Korean Broadcasting. Based on Korean authorities, the third pilot sitting behind two pilots, he pointed out some kind of misoperation in terms of altitude and speed just before the 54 seconds before crash. Did you find any important statement from him?
I'm not sure I understand your question. The first officer who was sitting in the jump seat behind the crew, you're asking if 54 seconds before the crash that he asked for, can you say it again?
Based on the Korean news, he pointed out some kind of misoperation in terms of altitude and speed. So did you find any important or specific statement from him?
I don't think that there's any statement that we have from the first officer that gets down to that level of specificity about 54 seconds prior to the crash. Sure. The question is, did the first officer who was sitting in the jump seat call for a missed approach or some other call 54 seconds prior to the crash? That information sounds very specific to me. We don't know of any statements or anything that happened 54 seconds specifically prior to the crash. I have not briefed on any statements that occurred 54 seconds prior to the crash. We do know that the crew members in the cockpit were talking to each other. We do know that the pilots recognized that they were high on the approach when they were further out. They recognized that they were low on the approach when they were closer in. The first officer did relay to us that he called out sync rate to the crew at a point on the approach because they were descending very quickly. But I don't have any information about anything at 54 seconds, so maybe there's confusion in the translation. I don't know. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us how long you interviewed the left and the right pilots, and also you characterize their demeanors as you interviewed them?
The question is, how long did we interview the pilots seated in the left and the right seat, and what was their demeanor during the interviews? I will tell you that the pilots were all extremely cooperative. These interviews were very long, very thorough interviews. They each lasted approximately 4 hours. We got a lot of very good information from them. And the crews were very cooperative.
Do one more question.
Sure. Yes.
Laura Nelson, Los Angeles Times. I was hoping you could speak briefly about air traffic control at SFO, if they noticed anything wrong and issued any warnings, and whether air traffic control has any policies related to foreign crews and what type of landing aids they can be using as they come into the airport.
The question is, were there any warnings provided by air traffic control? No. And we have briefed on this before, that air traffic control did not issue any warnings. They did not get any minimum safe altitude warnings. And the second question was whether or not SFO had any specific procedures regarding foreign crews. And I do not believe that they have any specific procedures that are different for foreign crews versus domestic crews. So there are no differences between the procedures. And that's the last question. I will be back tomorrow. Thank you all very much for your attention.